She thought she was picking up a passenger. It turned out he was picking out his next victim. A hard-working mother of 3, a dedicated taxi driver, and a woman known for her kindness, Victoria Mbwa Moloki's life came to a horrific and senseless end. What happened to her wasn't just a crime. It was an act of calculated cruelty that left her family shattered and a community in shock. It was September 27, 2024. The world kept moving. People went to work, sent their kids to school, made plans for the weekend. But for one woman, everything was about to change. A day that started with routine ended in horror. Victoria was behind the wheel of her car like she had been countless times before. Her job was simple: pick up passengers, drop them off, earn a living. But this time the man who stepped into her taxi wasn't just another client. He had no intention of reaching a destination. Hours later, she was gone. Her phone went silent. Calls went unanswered. No one knew where she was. The only clue was the name of the man she had picked up, Edwin Ngetich, a familiar passenger, a name she had no reason to fear. Until now, days later, her car turned up hundreds of kilometers away, driven by the very man who had last seen her. But Victoria was nowhere to be found. When police finally uncovered the truth, it was worse than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random act of violence. Edwin had done this before, and Victoria, she was never supposed to make it out alive. This is the horrifying case of Edwin Ngetich. Victoria Mbwa Moloki wasn't just another name in a tragic news report. She was a woman full of life, love, and an unshakable sense of duty. At 35 years old, she carried the weight of her world on her shoulders, not just as a taxi driver navigating the bustling streets of Mombasa, but as a mother whose entire existence revolved around her 3 children. Every mile she drove, every passenger she picked up, every late night spent behind the wheel, it was all for them. She had never been the type to complain, even when exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. Life had never been easy, but she had learned to push forward, to keep going no matter how heavy the burden. Those who knew her spoke of her kindness, the warmth in her voice when she greeted passengers, the way she always had a moment to check in on a friend. Victoria had a way of making people feel safe, a rare quality in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. She grew up in a modest home, raised by parents who taught her the value of hard work. From an early age, she understood that nothing in life would be handed to her. She would have to earn it, and she did. She worked tirelessly, first in small jobs to support herself, then eventually getting into the taxi business, a male-dominated field where women often had to prove themselves twice as much just to be taken seriously. Victoria had done just that. Over time, she built a steady clientele, people who knew her, who trusted her, tourists, businessmen, locals needing a ride to the market. She took them all, maneuvering through the city with the skill of someone who knew every shortcut, every back road, every way to avoid the chaotic rush-hour traffic. But her true purpose wasn't in the money she earned. It was in the 3 little faces waiting for her at home. Her children were everything to her. She wanted them to have the opportunities she never did, to go to school without worrying if the fees would be paid, to grow up knowing that their mother would always provide. Mornings in the Moloki household were a mix of hurried breakfasts, last-minute homework checks, and laughter. No matter how tired she was, Victoria made sure her children started their day with warmth and reassurance. She had a rule: never leave the house without a hug. But as much as she gave, life took its toll. The hours she worked were grueling, the streets of Mombasa were unpredictable, and she had seen the city's darker side more than once. She had picked up passengers who seemed a little too eager to know if she worked late nights. She had heard stories from other drivers, stories about passengers who weren't just looking for a ride, but something far worse. Still, she never let fear dictate her life. She was cautious but never paranoid, strong but never reckless. On September 27, 2024, it was just another day, or at least it should have been. Victoria had her usual routine, dropping her children off at school, checking her car, making sure she had enough fuel to last her through the long shifts ahead. She had a few regulars to pick up, then she would take whatever fares came her way. It was during one of those routine pickups that she accepted a ride that would change everything. The request came through like any other, a passenger needing a ride. No red flags, nothing unusual, just another trip, another fare, another step toward providing for her children. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last ride she would ever take. The transition into what happened next wasn't immediate. There was no alarm bell, no sudden realization of danger. The car doors closed, the engine hummed to life, and the city stretched out before her like it always did. But the man in her car had plans that went far beyond reaching his destination. Victoria had always been careful, always aware, but even the most cautious people can't predict the unthinkable, and on that day, the unthinkable found her. That morning, as the sun cast its golden glow over Mombasa's busy streets, Victoria prepared for another long day of work. The air was thick with the scent of the ocean, the sound of distant honking, and the chatter of vendors setting up their stalls. Life moved as it always did, fast, relentless, indifferent to the lives caught in its rhythm. She checked her phone, scanning for ride requests. It wasn't long before one came through. The name was familiar, Edwin Engetich, a previous passenger, someone she had transported before without issue. That alone was reassuring. In a job like hers, familiarity offered a small comfort. His request was for a long-distance trip from Mombasa to Samburu in Kwale County. It was farther than most of her usual fares, but long-distance trips meant good money, and with 3 children depending on her, any opportunity to bring in more was one she couldn't afford to pass up. Then came the unusual part. Edwin didn't want to book the ride through the app. He preferred to handle payment directly. It wasn't unheard of. Many drivers, especially those struggling to make ends meet, saw off planets a way to maximize earnings. No commission fees, no restrictions, just a direct transaction between driver and passenger. Perhaps Victoria hesitated for a moment. Maybe she weighed the risks in her mind. But there was nothing about Edwin that seemed threatening. She had driven him before. He had been polite, unremarkable. There was no reason to think twice. She agreed. The ride began as any other would. The city slowly faded into the distance, replaced by open roads lined with stretches of dry land and scattered trees. Victoria focused on the journey ahead, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind already planning the rest of her day. Maybe she was thinking about picking up the kids later, about what they'd have for dinner. Maybe she was looking forward to finally getting some rest after a long shift. But something was different this time. The silence in the car felt heavier than it should have. Edwin wasn't engaging in the usual small talk passengers often made. There was no casual conversation about the weather, no polite inquiry about how her day had been, just silence. Maybe that's when she first felt it, that strange nagging feeling in the back of her mind, the one that tells you something is off even when you can't quite explain why. Still, she pushed the thought away. She had no reason to be uneasy. The road stretched on, the city now long behind them. The landscape was emptier here, fewer cars, fewer people, just the occasional roadside shop, the distant hum of life that felt far away. Then something shifted. Edwin's tone, his posture, something changed. Perhaps it was subtle at first, a shift in his breathing, the way he adjusted himself in his seat. Maybe he asked a question that seemed a little too pointed, or maybe, without realizing it, she had already started to grip the wheel tighter. Then came the moment when she knew. Maybe it was when he told her to take an unfamiliar route, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was when she noticed him glancing at his phone too often, sending messages she couldn't see. Or maybe it was when he suddenly leaned forward, his voice lower, colder. The realization must have hit her like ice water. She was alone, on an empty road, with a man who was no longer just a passenger. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't always come in a sudden burst. Sometimes it creeps in, tightening its grip little by little, until you can't ignore it anymore. Victoria was no stranger to dangerous situations. As a taxi driver, she had encountered difficult passengers before, drunk ones, aggressive ones, those who tried to shortchange her. But this felt different. A deep, primal instinct must have screamed at her then. She needed to get out of this situation. Maybe she started calculating her options. How far was the nearest town? Would anyone hear her if she screamed? Could she turn the car around without him noticing? But she wasn't given the chance. Hours later, she was gone. No one knew where she was. No one had seen her, and the man who had been in her car had disappeared, leaving behind only questions. Questions that no one was prepared for the answers to. The hours that followed Victoria's disappearance were filled with an unbearable silence. For a woman who was always moving, always checking in, her sudden absence was like a siren blaring in the minds of those who loved her. Calls to her phone rang and rang until they went to voicemail. Messages sent to her remained unread, their blue ticks never appearing. Her mother was the first to feel the weight of dread settle in her chest. Victoria was responsible to a fault. She wouldn't just vanish without a word. Something was wrong. By nightfall, that fear had turned into certainty. With her heart pounding, she went to Makupa police station. She stood before the officers, her voice trembling but firm as she reported her daughter missing. It was a mother's worst nightmare, and she could already sense that this wasn't just a case of a lost phone or a delayed trip. Victoria had been taken. The police officers took down the report, but the response was familiar. A working adult missing for a few hours wasn't enough to sound the alarms. Maybe she had stopped somewhere to rest, maybe she was visiting a friend, maybe there was an innocent explanation. But Victoria's mother knew better. She had raised her daughter. She knew the way she lived her life, structured, disciplined, predictable. If Victoria wasn't answering, it wasn't by choice. The hours dragged into the next morning. By then, her family and friends had begun their own desperate search. They checked hospitals, they reached out to her colleagues, her clients, anyone who might have heard from her. But no one had. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Then came the first clue. Authorities traced her last known location to Samburu town, roughly 66 kilometers from Mombasa. It was unsettling. This wasn't a place Victoria had any reason to be. She hadn't mentioned any plans to travel there, and yet, according to the data, it was the last place she had been before her phone went dark. A search began, but there was nothing. No sign of her car, no trace of where she had gone next. It was as if she had vanished the moment she reached that town. Days passed, each one stretching into an eternity. The whispers began. In the quiet corners of Mombasa, where taxi drivers gathered, her name was spoken in hushed voices. Some feared the worst. Others clung to the hope that she would be found, that this was just a mistake, that she would walk through the door any moment now. But then the case took a chilling turn. Her car had been found. Not in Mombasa, not even near Samburu, but in Nakuru, over 400 kilometers away. The discovery sent shockwaves through everyone following the case. How had the car gotten so far from where she was last seen? More importantly, who had been driving it? The answer came swiftly. The man behind the wheel was Edwin Engetich, the same man who had booked that fateful ride, the same man who had been with her when she disappeared. But there was something even more unsettling. When police found him, he wasn't trying to run. He wasn't acting like a man desperate to cover his tracks. He was calm. Too calm. As officers surrounded him, he didn't resist. He stepped out of the vehicle without a word, his expression unreadable. There was no panic in his eyes, no fear, no urgency. It was as if he had been expecting this moment. The questions came fast and hard. Where was Victoria? What had happened to her? Why was he driving her car across the country? But Edwin had no answers, or rather, he refused to give any. Instead, he offered vague, inconsistent statements. First, he claimed Victoria had lent him the car. Then, when pressed further, he changed his story. She had given him permission to take it for a trip. And yet there was no evidence of any such arrangement, no calls, no messages, nothing that suggested she had willingly handed over her vehicle. The police weren't buying it. They knew something terrible had happened, and the man standing before them was at the center of it all. The moment Edwin Engetich was taken into custody, the air in the room shifted. Officers who had dealt with criminals of every kind before recognized something unnerving in his demeanor. He wasn't panicked, nor did he seem remorseful. His responses were calculated, as if he was piecing together a story rather than recalling events. The questions came at him relentlessly. Where was Victoria? What had he done to her? Why was he driving her car hundreds of kilometers away from where she was last seen? At first he denied everything. He claimed Victoria had willingly lent him the car, but there was no evidence to support that. No messages, no call logs, nothing that showed any agreement. The detectives pushed harder, unraveling his contradictions one by one. Hours passed. The tension in the interrogation room thickened. Then something changed. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of being cornered, or maybe it was the realization that there was no way out. Edwin's resolve cracked. His breathing grew heavier. His fingers tapped against the cold metal table in front of him. And then, in a quiet, almost indifferent voice, he said he would take them to her. The officers wasted no time. A convoy of police vehicles set off, sirens piercing the night. Edwin sat in the back of one, flanked by detectives, his hands bound, his face unreadable. He led them deep into Kiambu County, away from the main roads, away from any signs of life. The vehicle headlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness. Each turn they took seemed to lead them further into nowhere, the kind of place where secrets could remain buried forever. Then finally he told them to stop. The officers stepped out, their flashlights slicing through the eerie silence. The air was thick with the damp scent of earth and decay. It was a place that seemed untouched, a place that had no reason to be visited unless someone wanted someone hidden. Edwin pointed ahead. They walked cautiously, their boots crunching against the dirt and scattered leaves, and then, as the beams of light swept through the trees, one of the officers stopped. His breath caught in his throat. She was there. Victoria's body lay lifeless in the wilderness, far from home, far from the life she had once known. For a moment there was only silence. Even the officers, hardened by years of witnessing humanity's darkest acts, felt the weight of this discovery press upon them. The reality was undeniable. She hadn't just gone missing. She had been taken, discarded, like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. But what had happened in those final moments? How had a routine ride turned into something so horrific? The forensic team moved in, documenting every detail, every clue that could piece together the nightmare Victoria had endured. The medical examiner would later confirm what many feared: her death had not been quick. Back at the station, Edwin's demeanor remained unchanged. He was eerily calm, as if he had already made peace with whatever fate awaited him. But now the questions had changed. No longer was it about finding Victoria. Now it was about understanding why. As detectives peeled back the layers of Edwin's life, a chilling picture began to emerge. He wasn't just another passenger. He had been watching her, studying her routines. This wasn't random. It was planned. The question lingered in the air like a heavy fog. Was Edwin Getich acting alone, or was there someone else in the shadows, someone whose hands were just as stained with Victoria's suffering? The police weren't ready to take Edwin's confession at face value, not yet. They needed to know every detail of what had happened in those missing hours, the gap between the moment she picked him up and the moment she was left for dead in the wilderness. Dr. Johansson Odur's findings left little doubt. Victoria had endured brutal violence before her life was stolen from her. The blunt force trauma to her head suggested rage, an attack meant to silence her permanently, but that wasn't all. The marks on her neck painted an even darker picture. Someone had strangled her, and not in a way that was quick or merciful. It had taken time. She had suffered. Then there were the defensive wounds. Deep scratches and bruises covered her arms. Victoria had fought with everything she had, her body refusing to surrender, even when the odds were stacked against her. Whoever did this wasn't expecting a struggle. They weren't expecting her to resist, and yet she did. Forensic specialists combed through her remains, looking for any additional evidence that could provide a clearer picture of her final moments. Had she been drugged? Was there any sign of restraint before the violence escalated? Test results would take time, but the investigators couldn't afford to wait. Instead, they turned back to Edwin. His confession had been chilling, but it hadn't been complete. He had led them to her body, but his story had gaps wide enough to suggest he wasn't telling the whole truth. The room was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Edwin sat across from the detectives, his face unreadable. He had already admitted to being with Victoria that day. He had already led them to her body, but when they asked him the one question that mattered most, why? He hesitated. Then he said something that made the room go cold. I wasn't the only one there. The detectives exchanged glances. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing something as simple as a minor inconvenience. Who else? One of them asked. Edwin exhaled slowly, as if debating whether to say more. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. You'll find out soon enough. The words sent a ripple of unease through the room. There was no remorse in his voice, no fear of what was coming next, just certainty. The police knew they had to move fast. If someone else was involved, that meant Victoria's death wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was something deeper, something darker, and that meant one terrifying thing: it wasn't over yet. They began retracing Edwin's movements before and after Victoria's disappearance, looking for any connections, any inconsistencies, security footage, phone records, and financial transactions. Everything was under scrutiny. Footage from a gas station in Mariakani recorded hours after Victoria vanished showed Edwin stepping out of her car. He wasn't alone. Another man was with him, partially obscured by the vehicle. They spoke for a few minutes, their conversation appearing tense. Then the man handed Edwin something small, something that fit in the palm of his hand. Cash? A phone? A weapon? The quality of the footage made it difficult to tell, but one thing was clear: Edwin wasn't just some unhinged predator acting on impulse. There was someone else in the picture, someone who had a stake in whatever had happened to Victoria. But who? The detectives needed names, but Edwin wasn't offering any. He sat in silence, his hands clasped together, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. It was a game to him, a slow unraveling of events that he controlled. But then something changed. A call came in from a forensic analyst. Victoria's car had been thoroughly examined, and inside, buried beneath the passenger's seat, they had found something chilling. Traces of blood that didn't belong to her. It was fresh, and it matched someone in the police database. The puzzle pieces were finally falling into place. The man from the gas station wasn't just some passerby. He was someone known to law enforcement, someone with a record, and now they had a name. Whoever he was, he had been close enough to Victoria to leave his own blood behind. But why? Had she fought back hard enough to wound him? Had there been a struggle in the car before she was taken? Or had something gone wrong between him and Edwin? One thing was certain, Victoria's murder was not as simple as a single act of violence. It was bigger than that. The truth was about to explode. What had initially seemed like a singular act of violence, a horrifying tragedy that ended the life of one woman, was unraveling into something far worse. Victoria's murder was not a crime of passion, nor was it a random attack. It was part of a pattern, one that had remained buried for years, concealed by a calculated mind that had perfected the art of deception. As investigators dug deeper into Edwin Gedici's past, they found echoes of Victoria's fate in cases that had long been considered cold. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear she wasn't the first. One name in particular stood out: George Nguna, a taxi driver, just like Victoria, missing under eerily similar circumstances. The last person seen with him? Edwin. Back in July 2014, George had picked up a client for what should have been a routine trip. His route had taken him outside the city, and then, without warning, he had vanished. His taxi was later found abandoned in a remote area, stripped of valuables, its doors left wide open as if someone had fled in a hurry, but George himself was never seen again. At the time, there had been whispers, theories. Had he been carjacked? Had he been the victim of a botched robbery? But without a body, without clear evidence, the case had faded into obscurity. Now, nearly a decade later, it was being dragged back into the light. Edwin had been questioned about George's disappearance back then, but with no proof, no direct link, he had walked away untouched. He had blended back into the city, slipping through the cracks of an overburdened system. And now, it seemed, he had used that same playbook again, only this time he had made a fatal mistake. With Victoria's case dominating the headlines, the police were under pressure to dig deeper, to prove that they hadn't let a predator operate unchecked for years. Edwin's arrest set off a chain reaction of investigations that led officers across the country. Mount Elgon, Buteru, Usingishu, Nakuru. Everywhere they looked, they found traces of his crimes. In a hidden compound outside Nakuru, officers recovered 5 vehicles, all reported stolen. Some had been repainted, their registration details altered, but the forensic evidence didn't lie. Each car had once belonged to a missing driver, men who had seemingly vanished without a trace. And it wasn't just cars. Investigators combing through Edwin's financial records noticed something else. Large, unexplained cash deposits spaced out over the years, always appearing after a disappearance, always withdrawn just as suddenly. It painted a chilling picture of a man who wasn't just a murderer, but a calculated criminal, someone who had been profiting off stolen vehicles and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose him. As the police put the pieces together, they realized something even more terrifying. Victoria's murder hadn't been a desperate act or a moment of uncontrollable rage. It had been a routine one. Edwin had followed before, one he likely would have followed again. They needed to know how many victims there really were. Word spread fast, and soon families of other missing drivers came forward. Mothers who had spent years searching for their sons, wives who had held on to hope that their husbands would walk through the door again. Each story carried eerie similarities. Drivers hired for long trips, last seen with a mysterious passenger. Their vehicles found, but their bodies never recovered. One woman, tearful and clutching an old, worn-out photograph, spoke about her brother, Peter, who had vanished in 2017. He had been a taxi driver in Eldoret, picking up clients in the early morning hours, his phone ringing constantly with new requests. Then one night, he had gone silent. His car was found a week later in a different county, its seats stained, his ID missing. No one had ever been arrested. The woman showed investigators old text messages from her brother, messages he had sent the night he disappeared. One, in particular, sent a chill down their spines. "This guy is acting weird, says we have to change the route." The last message he ever sent. Who was this guy? The police were starting to suspect they already knew the answer. With mounting pressure, Edwin's once stoic demeanor began to crack. The arrogance he had displayed during his initial questioning was fading. He no longer smirked when they asked him about the missing men. Instead, he stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact. And then, just as investigators prepared to hit him with fresh charges, he muttered something under his breath. "They were in the way." The officers leaned in. "What did you say?" Edwin exhaled sharply, his hands clenched into fists. "They were in the way," he repeated, this time louder. The room fell into silence. It was a confession, but not in the way they had expected. There was no remorse, no regret, just cold, detached words that made it clear he had never seen his victims as people. They were obstacles, problems to be erased. But there was still one thing investigators couldn't shake. Had he done all of this alone? Because if he hadn't, that meant one terrifying possibility. Someone else was still out there. The thought was unbearable. Had Edwin really acted alone? Or was there another shadow lurking just beyond the reach of justice? Investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that someone else had been involved. The scale of his crimes, the precision with which he had covered his tracks for years, suggested that either he was a master manipulator or there was another player in the dark. As forensic teams revisited the crime scenes, tracing every lead, one detail stood out. Edwin had never disposed of the stolen cars himself. He had connections, people willing to take the vehicles, alter their identities, and push them into the black market. If there was an accomplice, it wasn't just someone who helped him commit the murders, it was someone who profited from them. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Edwin maintained his silence on the subject. He had confessed to the killings, coldly dismissing his victims as obstacles in his way, but when pressed about whether he had worked with someone else, he merely smirked. If there was another name, he wasn't going to be the one to say it. Meanwhile, Victoria's family was left in ruins. Her children, too young to fully understand why their mother was never coming home, were now caught in a cycle of grief and confusion. They had been robbed of a future with her, stolen away in a crime that had no justification, only cruelty. Her colleagues, the taxi drivers of Mombasa, once moved freely through the streets, trusting that their work would get them home at the end of the day. Now, every call they answered came with a flicker of doubt. Every new passenger brought a moment of hesitation. Was this another fare, or another nightmare waiting to unfold? Victoria's funeral was a heartbreaking sight. Her family, her friends, and the community that had once taken safety for granted now stood together, mourning the woman they had lost. The air was heavy, not just with sorrow, but with anger. How had a predator like Edwin been allowed to roam free for so long? How many times had the justice system failed to stop him before he took another life? But in the midst of their grief, there was also a demand for change. The taxi drivers vowed to be more vigilant, to look out for one another, to never allow another Victoria to meet the same fate. They pushed for better safety measures, for authorities to do more than just react to tragedies, to prevent them. Edwin would face trial. His name would be etched into the pages of Kenya's most horrifying criminal cases. But no matter the sentence, no punishment could undo what he had done. No courtroom verdict could bring back the lives he had stolen. And that is the cruelest part of all. If you believe innocent people should not be killed for another person's gain, subscribe to the channel. Only those who think their lives don't matter will ignore this.